Our next is time for our guest speaker presentation. We are fortunate to have Jean Willoughby, who is the interim executive co-director of the Agrarian Trust, which is a non-profit farmland trust. She has served in multiple roles since joining as the founding advisor in 2013, and she rejoined the team in 2023. She has been a trainer with the Racial Equity Institute for the past 6 years and is the founder of Health Equity Resources and Education, LLC. Jean's writing on race, climate, and the food system have appeared in Yes magazine. Her book, Nature's Remedies, an Illustrated Guide to Healing Herbs, that is, was published by Chronicle Books. With more than a decade of experience in economic development with food systems and cooperative enterprises, Jean's work focuses on advancing more equitable outcomes through building partnerships and leadership development. As a trainer, her work focuses on equity and power analysis, institutional and community organizing, and movement building. Alongside her colleagues, Jean has worked with 100 plus nonprofit corporate, community, municipal, state, and federal government institutions, including the NIH, CDC, and many others. Jean has worked with food and farm organizations across the country, including the Triangle Land Conservancy and the Massachusetts Food System Collaborative. She's a trained clinical herbalist. Jean will graduate from David Winston Center for Herbal Studies in 2024. She is working to establish a medicinal herb farm while assisting clients with post-viral recovery and their broader health and wellness goals. Jean earned a BA in sociology from Wesleyan University and completed studies in biology and chemistry at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Raised in Central Arkansas and Southern California, she now calls North Central Florida her home. Please join me in welcoming Jean Willoughby as the guest speaker of this year's Berkshire Community Land Trust annual meeting.
Wow, thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's great to be here. Just wanted to make sure everyone can hear me and see me. Okay. And so it's just great to just be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I did have about a week to prepare, so it was a little last minute, but I'm so thrilled to get to join you all. It's really, again, an honor to be with people who are doing work that I really admire. It sounds like someone might need to mute. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Is anyone else having that? Okay, just want to make sure before I jump in. And so I just want to present a few slides, but I'd really just love to hone in. I was really invited to focus on really the importance of community ownership, especially during this time, and how community ownership can play a role in a more equitable and regenerative future. And I think you all are a testimony to that already. You don't need me here to convince you. I'd be preaching to the choir, but I do think it's important to understand really how we got here. And so because Robert did such a fabulous job introducing me, I won't say too much about my background, but I did start my career about 17 years ago in public health. And from there, that's where I transitioned into the arena of food and agriculture. And it was really because I was working in two of the largest community health centers in Connecticut and New York City, where I worked in my early career. We were witnessing just a tidal wave of dietary and lifestyle related diseases and disorders. And I felt that I needed to get to the root causes behind it. I wanted to understand it better, and that led me to food and agriculture. And so I spent the next part of my career working at the Rural Advancement Foundation International. Anyone know RAFI? Any hands up? So RAFI is a major organization that's been around for close to 80 years now. They started as a sharecroppers movement organization. And something that I learned much later is that one of the biggest cross-racial alliances ever to emerge was the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. And this was really focused on sharecroppers. And they formed in Tyronza, Arkansas. And I grew up in Arkansas, not knowing this history at all. It was a multiracial endeavor that ultimately led to the founding of a massive sharecroppers movement, farmer movement, and that ultimately resulted in the creation of the Rural Advancement Foundation International, where I found myself working. And in 2012, I learned a really startling fact that changed the course of my career, I learned that 98% of all farmland in the country is owned by white families. And I found that shocking. I don't think we should be surprised based on our history, but I think we should always be shocked. I think we should never lose our moral capacity for shock. And that fact alone really put me on a mission to understand how we got here. How could we have such a massive inequity in land ownership? And what might I do to help, kind of put my shoulder to the wheel to close that massive gap? Because I realized very quickly, because land appreciates in value over time, this is just going to put gasoline on the racial wealth gap, that we'll never close the racial wealth gap if that remains the case. So what can we do to create more equitable land ownership opportunities? And also for farmers of color, of course, but also for young and beginning farmers of all backgrounds, people like myself. Part of why I got involved with Agrarian Trust 10 years ago was that I really wanted to start a farm, and I thought that community-based ownership sounded pretty good and might, honestly, based on my own self-interest, I was thinking, wow, maybe this is an option for me. Having graduated with substantial college debt, being a millennial who was hit by 2 recessions, something like Agrarian Trust was sounding pretty good. And so I got involved as a founding advisor because I had been working with hundreds of farmers across the Southeast to try to help them transition their farms to sustainable and regenerative agricultural practices. That's really what RAFI focused on. And so that really led me into understanding that the Community Land Trust has an amazing and radical history. But first I want to kind of explain, why do we even need to be here? Why do we even need community land trusts? What really got us here? And I think nothing does it better than a timeline. And so I'm going to share my screen, and I'd like to walk through this timeline because it's been something that's been very powerful for me. And I want to return to it at the end of this, 15 or 20 minutes that I'll be taking to share with you some different, really inspiring examples of community ownership models. But first, I want to start with, why do we even need community ownership models? And I think this timeline really says it all, right? And I want to lift up the work of Doctors Michael Bird and Linda Clayton. Has anyone heard of them? They are 2 Harvard-trained physicians who were married, African-American doctors with their, obviously the MD, but they were also both have their MPH, and they presented an online presentation that covered a timeline of US history. And I found it so compelling that I wanted to update it. And they also are the authors of a 2-volume work called An American Health Dilemma. So you can imagine, as someone who comes from a public health background, why that would be so intriguing to me. It's a fantastic work, really worth your time. But this is adapted from that book and from their presentation. We really need to start in 1607 if we're talking about the situation we're in now. Why is that? Because for 400 years, the biggest source of agricultural income in the United States was what? Does anyone know? From 1607 to the year 2000, what did we grow that was such the moneymaker? Tobacco, right? So we were a glorified tobacco colony for much of our history. In fact, starting in 1607 with the first permanent English settlement, for 258 years, all this nation knew, the colonial experience and into the US experience, all we knew was indentured servitude and chattel slavery. That was our labor system. That's 62% of the life of this nation. For another 103 years after that, all we knew was Jim Crow legal segregation. 1968 is, of course, when we passed a Fair Housing Act, for the first time making it illegal to discriminate based on race, nationality, sex, and so on and so forth in housing. That's another 25%. So if you're doing the math, you can see that we're up to 87% of the life of this nation. All we knew was servitude, slavery, and segregation. Right? 87%. And in the most recent era, from 1968 to 2020, through our current era, that's about 52 to 55 years, right? Since we finally made it illegal to discriminate against people in housing. That's only 13% of the life of this nation, in which we can say that most citizenship rights have been granted to people. We still have a racial wealth gap. We've got an achievement gap. We've got health disparities. We've got implicit bias. I think it's important to recognize the era that we're in. And why do we need community-based interventions so desperately? And I think this timeline speaks to it better than I can in 15 minutes, right? So this really, to me, is what drives my work forward, because this 13%, this is just the beginning of our current era, right? And so we really do stand on the shoulders of giants. There are two ways of looking at this history. We could be overwhelmed and pessimistic and say, gosh, 87% of our history was just segregation and slavery and servitude. I mean, that's overwhelming. No wonder we're having the problems we're still having today. No wonder the top 1% owns, what is it, 90% of the wealth, right? We haven't seen numbers like that since just before the Great Depression in terms of the concentration of wealth. So we know that we're suffering from a lot of the same problems that we were 100 years ago. And so we could feel very overwhelmed by that. But I think there's also a hopeful view. When we look at this chart, we can also see that this is the first time as a society when we've been able to even imagine what an equitable future could look like. We're only 13% in. And so we have to be patient with ourselves as a society, because we're just kind of starting to grasp how we might move forward. What types of legal structures are going to be most empowering? How do communities hold land and property together in ways that advance, regenerative agriculture and equity, and build wealth for communities? How do we do all of that? So there are a lot more questions and answers. And I think that, in fact, if you leave this evening and my talk with more curiosities and questions and answers, I feel that I will have done my job, because I really just do want to spark curiosity. And so I want to share some community-based ownership models that I think really invite a lot of questions, curiosity, research. And I hope that you'll take some of these forward and look into them for yourself and see what might be relevant for the work you're doing, or just ways to support all of these different initiatives that are emerging just in the last few years alone. And why do I put 2020, by the way, to 2023 as its own kind of mini era? 2020 marked a turning point, not only because of COVID, the murder of George Floyd, but a change in investing in this country is really taking hold. There has been more investment just in the past 3 years in regenerative agriculture than in the decades prior. There's been more investment in anti-racist training and education in the past 3 years than ever before. Over $2 billion invested in anti-racist training and education. That's never happened before in US history. The efforts toward repatriation, land back, reparations, in the last 3 years alone, more has been accomplished than in any other era in modern times toward those goals. More land has been transferred, right? And it's ongoing. So I really think that we've entered into a new era, and this is the first time, again, that we could even imagine what equity could look like. So let's open that window, let's look through that and see what we see. And so here are a few examples of what I think represents communities like yourselves making history, whether it's employee ownership, to community land trusts, to community-based affordable housing developments, community-run HOAs, the commons, which is what Agrarian Trust works in, to kind of a newer kid on the block. Has anyone heard of a PREC? Raise your hand or give me a thumbs up or something. So I see 1 or 2 hands up, right? So that's a sort of, I call them the new kids on the block, but I'm really excited to share with you a little bit about this model known as a permanent real estate cooperative. So I'll be closing with a look at those, as well as looking at Agrarian Trust. And I only have, 15, 20 minutes or so to share some of the amazing stuff that these groups have done, that they've accomplished. I will just say briefly of community. I'm not going to talk too much about employee ownership. I think there are just numerous examples. I recently moved to Florida because I can't think of a better place for a racial equity trainer to live, personally. And my husband actually works at MIT Press, and he works in publishing. And so I can't think of a state better for a book lover and for a racial equity trainer to be in. And so doing a lot of organizing down here, as you can imagine. But I was really amazed to find out that the largest employee-owned company in the country is based in Florida. So does anyone know what that is? Could anyone take a guess? And you get the door prize for the night if you can guess, because it really surprised me. I'll just say that. So does anyone happen to know? I'll check the chat in case someone's putting their answer in the chat. So I'm hearing cricket so far, so I don't think that anyone may know. But it astounded me to learn that Publix Supermarkets is the largest employee-owned company in the United States today. And I think that's incredibly hopeful in terms of the scale. I'm not defending Publix in terms of their business practices. I don't know anything about them, to be honest with you, because I just moved to Florida. So I tend to shop at my local co-op, and I tend to shop, of course, at the local mom and pops. And so I'm not going to Publix all that often. But I am finding that, that surprised me a lot. 80% of the shares are owned by the employees. So that tells you something. Employee ownership can scale. It can scale to being one of the biggest companies in this country. And the fact that it's in the food system was also intriguing to me. I also want to highlight the Industrial Areas Foundation. Is anyone familiar with Saul Alinsky's work? He wrote Reveille for Radicals and also Rules for Radicals. This is a nearly 80-year-old organization. I believe they're 75 years old or so. They've been doing extraordinary work around community-owned land and housing for decades, for just decades. And their group, Metro IIF, which is working in New York City, has secured more affordable housing than any other group in the country. And so that is just extraordinary. And they have community-run HOA systems and just a very different approach to housing than I've ever seen in the affordable housing world. So I'll highlight them. The Sustainable Economies Law Center probably needs no introduction. They are a phenomenal resource to all of us who are trying to create more equitable community-based ownership models. They helped us at the Agrarian Trust write our bylaws way back when to create a more equitable structure. The East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative and the Willow Permanent Real Estate Co-op. Has anyone heard of Willow? They just recently formed and they're in Massachusetts. And so I wanted to highlight them because they're just a really amazing example of how an idea can take hold from coast to coast. So the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Co-op is the first of its kind. And they were founded in 2017. The Sustainable Economies Law Center played a big role in helping them get off the ground. And they really minted or coined that term, permanent real estate permanent real estate cooperative. I keep wanting to throw investment in there because of the other acronym. And I threw you all in here too, because I know that it's important to flatter the group that invites you to speak. No, I'm just kidding. I put us in here because we're all doing this work. We're really trying to make history. And it's really making a difference. For the first time in history, we're seeing massive investment in community wealth building initiatives. I just wanted to share this. I firmly believe that public investment is essential to what we're doing, and that the reason we even have to do what we are doing is because the USDA wasn't doing its job very well for, a good 100+ years. The USDA has been sued more significantly, I will say, than any other government agency. They paid out billions in settlements to farmers who they discriminated against. Black farmers led the way with the settlement that was decided in 1999, Pigford versus Glickman. Then Hispanic farmers or Latino farmers, women farmers. There was a massive claims process and a settlement. And so the USDA really has a lot to answer for. And now the federal government is really stepping up and promoting regenerative and equitable development through a lot of community-based endeavors. And so I just wanted to share that building community wealth is a priority of this current administration. This is unimaginable to see language like this. Even 10, 15 years ago, we were never seeing anything like this before. And the fact that advancing community wealth building projects is a priority, and that they're also working to prevent physical and economic displacement as a result of investment, because we know that investment is not all created equal. Investment can lead to displacement. And so this work to facilitate equitable flows of private capital, including to underserved communities. This is taking place particularly with the increasing land access grant that was made to program. Grants are made to 50 organizations across the country. Over $300 million has just been invested or will be invested over the next 5 years to communities across the country involved in equitable and regenerative land-based work. Agrarian Trust is the second or third highest funded group in that mix. We just received a nearly $13 million grant to finance community-based land projects all across the country. So what we're doing is making a difference, and government's taking notice, and they're supporting our work in ways we've never seen before. And so I want to lift up just a couple of examples before I kind of want to stop and take questions at the end, make time for Q&A to talk about any of the models that people find interesting, intriguing, want to learn more about. I often find I love to hear people's questions because inevitably other people are going to think of something I haven't thought of, and it's going to get me curious, and I'm going to go and try to find more information. We're just living in a time where there's so many different experiments being made in community ownership, and there's so much to know that I just feel like I'm always looking something new up. And recently I learned about the Nehemiah strategy. Has anyone heard of Nehemiah? This is astounding to me that this project's been around since the 1980s, and it's considered the most consequential community development in the country. This has generated well over $1.5 billion in wealth for largely Black and Brown communities in New York, in places that were formerly just largely abandoned. And the home building strategy here is remarkable. The home ownership strategy in general, and the community-based HOA system that they've developed to manage these properties through competitive lottery for who gets access to the homes. And so it's just one of the most amazing projects that I've ever heard of. They were recently profiled just last year on CBS. Ted Koppel interviews Reverend David Brawley of the St. Paul Community Baptist Church and East Brooklyn congregations. And this story is really an extraordinary collaboration between the Industrial Areas Foundation and local congregations to make affordable housing a priority and to keep the management of it within the community, right? And so I just wanted to lift this up as something to get curious about, to learn more about. I can't go into all the finer points of how they operate, but they have just achieved extraordinary things. And so I think one of the most important aspects of community-based ownership is how it generates hope in people's lives and how it generates agency and a sense of power. And so this is a story that I think I wanted to lift up. And so I want to move forward just because of time mainly to cover a little bit more about the permanent real estate cooperatives. And so I wanted to share a little bit about how these operate. Here's the East Bay, and here's the Willow Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. And as you all are probably familiar, co-op just has democracy embedded in its structure because it's one person, one vote. You can't buy more shares of a co-op and get more votes, right? That's the essential aspect of it that makes it a far more democratic corporation than any other type of corporation. And so cooperative corporations are also limited in their ability to pay high returns on capital, which means that they can't be vehicles to make the wealthy wealthier, right? We know we suffer from both concentrated poverty and concentrated wealth in our society, and that is by structural design. And so cooperatives really play a role in breaking that framework of making the wealthy wealthier, right, because of the return on capital. And so we also should lift up that the Sustainable Economies Law Center has been able to accomplish something that is almost French in its transformative power in terms of the investment structure. What do I mean by that? In France, average citizens can actually buy shares in farm projects because of a kind of structure within French law that makes it much easier, I will say this, to gain investments from the community for businesses. And so in California, SELC was able to, the Sustainable Economies Law Center was able to write and pass a law that increased the California Cooperative Corporation security exemption, allowing them to raise capital by selling membership shares for up to $1,000 each. So again, it's almost French in its capacity for raising investment from the community to support local land-based projects. And so cooperative corporations are different from community land trusts in that they can take capital in multiple forms. They have greatly expanded financing options because of that. Unlike 501c3s, they're not constrained to providing housing to low and moderate income people, and they can help spread the expectation that everyone, high and low income alike, should stop profiting from property and live in price stabilized housing. And cooperatives, lastly, are platforms for mutual aid rather than charity. And so these are some of the different models that really give me a lot of hope for the future of community-based ownership. And so this is a little bit more about the entity structure. I pretty much kind of glossed over this just now, so I'm going to move forward from here. And I'm going to end with the Agrarian Commons. So I would be remiss if I didn't highlight my own organization's work in this arena, that the Agrarian Commons Initiative is a collaborative endeavor that works to develop community-based land ownership structures and resources. And so we have a 501c3, and we work with communities to establish 501c2 landholding entities. We don't always use the C2 model. Some communities prefer it. Others want to form their own C3. And so we're navigating the fact that there's really just not a one-size-fits-all or even a one-size-fits-most approach to how communities want to hold land collectively. I want to highlight that our founding boards of directors for the first 10 Agrarian Commons, which are in states all over the country, were 58% women, 63% farmers, and 85% local to the regions where each Agrarian Commons is located. And so we're really proud of having built this wide network of commons groups over time, and we feel that the commons model is one that can evolve. And we're really excited to learn more from the permanent real estate cooperatives to see if that might be a good fit for some of the groups that we're working with that want to focus on housing. In particular, we've been approached multiple times by farm workers who are looking to develop their own farm worker cooperatives for housing. And that's really exciting. And we've never seen anything like that before in this country either. And so just because we're doing this work within the commons, we're getting approached with groups with by groups with even more ideas than we've thought of before. And we really see our role as helping educate philanthropy around the importance of regenerative and equitable models in land and agriculture. And so I want to close there to make sure that there's time for a Q&A and just to maybe talk about some of the models that you all found interesting or intriguing, inspiring. And again, thank you all so much for allowing me to come speak and share a little bit of my enthusiasm, my wild enthusiasm for this work. And again, let me thank you for what you all are doing. It's incredibly inspiring, and it's so wonderful to get to share this space with you all. So Robert, I believe I'll hand the mic back to you.
Thank you so much. You're a wonderful, wonderful shot of hope into my life. All the projects you were just describing are just, they make me feel better. But are there questions that people could pose? If everyone would just take turns, because I don't know how to raise hands or anything like that. But if you have a question, please state it. And if you hear someone else asking a question, wait until they're done and then ask yours. Carry on.
Okay, I'll start. Hi, my name's Sophia. It's my first time at one of these meetings, but I'm from Great Barrington and worked at Prairie Whale, have been farming in the region for a while. I'm currently at Vermont Law School and Yale School of the Environment studying exactly this problem. Specifically, a lot of the things that you raised, Jean, about the Agrarian Trust. And I just wanted to lift it up as like a young person at this meeting. Like, these are the models that young people are looking towards so that we can continue to live in these communities. Like, the reason I'm in grad school is because I didn't see a future for myself farming in the Berkshires because I just couldn't make enough money. I didn't have housing security. So, and I don't want the traditional path. Like, I don't see that happening. We need each other. I think that's a big takeaway from all of this is like, we can do more together. So these types of models are so exciting for me and a lot of the young people that I'm in community with in the Hudson Valley and the Berkshires. So just wanted to like affirm everything that's been said and say that these conversations are happening. And then my question for Jean is, do you know what the barriers are in this region at all for the securities exemption that SELT got passed in California for permanent real estate cooperative? If people are working on that, is that some sort of initiative that should be started? Yeah.
That's a great question. And that's exactly what I'd hope for, is that someone will ask me a question about something I don't know, so that I have something to go and research after this. Because, you know, I think it's just endless. There's just, every state is different when it comes to the legal challenges. We've run into different unexpected legal issues in different states with the commons model, for example, and trying to do a 99-year lease, for example, if that's not supported by state law in, particularly in the Midwest. There's a lot of challenges there that are interesting that we're finding workarounds for. But I'd love to look that up, and I don't know if anyone here knows. But I cede the floor if anyone has more information on that. So it looks like we have a community research project to do. Thank you.
Well, actually, I'm going to count on Sophia, and we're to be able to answer this at next year's meeting. Thank you. Are there other questions or comments?
And I do have one last, just quick reflection, but I do want to make time for folks to ask questions.
In the teaching profession, this is called wait time. We're waiting for questions.
No question, but I do want to express my appreciation. It's an inspiration to hear from you and to have this perspective that you gave us, particularly the historical and the chronological perspective. So thank you.
Thanks, Eric. I appreciate that. And that's actually, if folks don't have any other questions for the moment, that's actually what I wanted to go back to, because I sometimes just look at this timeline that I showed you all and I think about it. And the reflection I want to leave you all with is, what if the pace of social change is accelerating, right? We can document it. 258 years, 103 years, 52 years, just the last 3 years have seen extraordinary change. What can we do to accelerate the pace of social change? Because this history, again, we could feel overwhelmed by the fact that 87% of our time has been just utter exploitation. Or we could think, wow, we're just at the beginning of something, of reimagining what this country can look like with equitable models in place. And I won't, spend too much time on this or get partisan or political, but elections are coming up. Do you know your reps, by name, and can you call them up and find out where they are on things? If they're, for example, if they sit on a House Agriculture Committee, things like that really matter. And advocating for the Lasso Act that would make funding permanent at, I believe, $100 million a year to fund work like what Agrarian Trust is doing. So we have an opportunity right now that's just absolutely historic to bring government investment to bear. And we know, again, government bears a lot of the responsibility for why we're in such an inequitable arrangement today. Just the Homestead Acts alone, 93 million Americans are descendants of beneficiaries of the Homestead Act. 93 million people. I mean, that is the source of our racial wealth gap right there, just by itself. Right, that alone. And so we really have to make amends, and there are so many ways we can do so. I think of it kind of like climate change. We can be overwhelmed and think there's just too many things we have to do, Or we can kind of invert that and think, oh, wow, actually, everything we do matters. Everything counts. And that's how I prefer to look at it, is that there's so many options for us to take action. And, how do we put our shoulders to the wheel and accelerate the pace of social change? Because that's what we're in the midst of. Again, we can see it from that timeline, that the pace is accelerating, and that the way that we decide to be gatekeepers or power brokers, or the way that we decide to use the power we have is incredibly consequential. I carry a quote with me everywhere I go from the great Alice Walker, who's of course a novelist, and she says that the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. And I think that we're in a time of enormous peril, but great promise at the same time. And how are we going to shift the ratio? I'm not an economist, so I don't speak in ratios so much. I'm a sociologist that likes to make fun of economists from time to time, is what I like to say. But I call it the P to P ratio, right? The promise to peril ratio. So what are we doing to increase the promise and decrease the peril in our lives? And community ownership is certainly one way that we do that. We know that, for example, CLT-owned homes were far less likely to be foreclosed on in the foreclosure crisis. The Nehemiah homes that I just shared with you, only a handful of them were foreclosed on during subprime, and they were in the heart of it in New York City. They had thousands of homes, and they rode that out. They rode that storm out. So community-based ownership is not only better for the soul and for the spirit and our ethics, but it actually weathers downturns far better than market-based strategies. It works, right? From even just a pure economist point of view, it's a safer strategy for protecting and building community-based wealth.
I just, on behalf of the Land Trust and everybody who's participating in this event this evening, thanks ever so much for a truly inspirational talk.